Hello, I'm Patrick Egan, Assistant Professor of Politics here at New York University. On behalf of NYU, I welcome you to a roundtable discussion on reforming the 2012 presidential nomination calendar sponsored by the National Presidential Caucus. We convene here today at NYU to address a question that has perplexed both politicians and pundits over the past 4 decades. How can we choose the Democratic and Republican nominees for president in a way that is both fair and encourages the best candidates to emerge as the winners? This dilemma has become increasingly relevant with each presidential nomination season since 1972, when changes in the rules placed the nominations in the hands of voters rather than party leaders for the first time. These changes have allowed the 2 states with the earliest contests, Iowa and New Hampshire, to wield an enormous amount of influence over the process. Only in 2 instances, George McGovern in 1972 and Bill Clinton in 1992, has any candidate won the Republican or Democratic nomination without winning either Iowa or New Hampshire. As a result, since the mid-'80s, the trend has been for other states to move their contests ever earlier in order to have more of a say. This so-called front-loading phenomenon has in turn led presidential aspirants to announce their candidacies earlier, raise money earlier, and in many cases bow out of the race altogether because of their inability to raise millions of dollars necessary to compete on the grand scale required. The front-loading process reached its all-time peak in 2008, when no fewer than 26 primaries and caucuses were held on Super Tuesday, February 5th. By that time, a field that originally included more than a dozen serious contenders had been winnowed down to just 2 Democrats and 3 Republicans with viable candidacies. Political observers fear that Super Tuesday is the harbinger of a not-too-distant future when nearly all of the states will hold their contests on the same day in a national primary, diminishing the quality of the process. More than ever before, officials in both the Democratic and Republican parties are considering how to reform the nomination process in order to stave off this result. Now, would-be reformers of the process need to balance 2 competing principles. The first is to preserve the unique style of face-to-face campaigning that is required to compete effectively in states like Iowa and New Hampshire. In these states, small, politically engaged electorates can scrutinize presidential candidates to a degree that is unheard of in most democracies throughout the world. But these 2 states are unrepresentative of the broader American population in a host of ways, which leads us to the second principle, giving every American as equal a say as possible in the nomination process. Leaders from more populous states that are more representative of Americans' ethnic and ideological diversity have long chafed against the outsized amount of influence that smaller, more homogeneous states have on the nomination process. They have understandably wanted increased influence for their states and have done so by moving up their nomination contests. The plans that have been advanced by reformers seek to balance the 2 principles I've just discussed. Each attempts to preserve the tradition of retail politics that accompanies small state caucuses and primaries on the one hand, while guaranteeing that residents of more populous states have a fair say in the process on the other. One of these proposals is known as the Ohio Plan, and it has been promoted by one of today's panelists, Ohio GOP Chairman Robert Bennett, and it will serve as a springboard for our conversation today. Like all of these plans, it balances the kinds of principles that I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to leave a discussion of these plans to our panelists. I want to encourage the panelists in these discussions to consider sort of a broader question. What do you say to those who think that the system, for all of its flaws, is fine as is? It is arguable that despite the fears of observers, the presidential nomination process of 2008 was a success. Large fields of Democratic and Republican candidates faced intense scrutiny by the voters of Iowa and New Hampshire. The results of these contests shaped, but did not completely determine, who the eventual nominees would be. A narrowed field then faced off on Super Tuesday on February 5th, and that day ended with John McCain as the all-declared victor on the Republican side, despite serious financial and other resource advantages of his opponent Mitt Romney. On the other side, Barack Obama were just beginning their historic one-on-one battle that did not end until June. And the result is that an unprecedented number of Americans became informed about the candidates and participated in the process. So my question to the panelists is therefore this: isn't the system, with all of its imperfections, perhaps working? And furthermore, how likely is this doomsday scenario of a one-day national primary? Do we really expect states to continue to move up their primary and caucus states? For in many respects, the states that took part in Super Tuesday this year had a diminished rather than augmented amount of influence in choosing the nominees in 2008. Won't this give some states pause about moving their contests up earlier next time around? And I ask these questions not only because of their relevance, but because they are exactly the sorts of challenges reformers will face from those with a stake in the process. Those who wish to improve the system not only need to build a better electoral mousetrap, they also must justify it to the host of people who are suspicious of top-down changes to the status quo. And so without further ado, let's proceed with today's discussion. To get things started, it is my pleasure to introduce Don Means, Director of the National Presidential Caucus, and the convener of today's roundtable. Don.